Morning, my mother-in-law handed me a garbage bag and told me to pack my things. She was wearing her church cardigan, the pale blue one with the pearl buttons. I remember thinking how strange that was, that someone could do something so cruel while looking so composed, so Sunday morning decent. My husband stood in the doorway of our bedroom and said nothing. That was 3 years ago. Last Tuesday, $58 million cleared into my business account. By Wednesday morning, I had 91 missed calls. Let me back up. I was 26 when I married into that family. My husband, I'll call him that because that's what he was, legally, for 7 years, came from old Georgia money. Not flashy money. The quiet kind. The kind that sits in land trusts and municipal bonds and gets passed down through handshakes at country clubs where everyone knows everyone's grandfather. His mother, who I will simply call my mother-in-law because that's the only title she ever wanted from me, had built her identity entirely around that legacy. Who belonged to it? Who didn't? I didn't. I grew up in Akron, Ohio. My dad worked for the city water department for 31 years. My mom taught 3rd grade at the same elementary school she had attended as a child. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable in the way that my mother-in-law understood comfort, which was to say we didn't have a name that meant anything to anyone. And to her, that was the only poverty that mattered. She made sure I knew it from the first Thanksgiving. I had brought a sweet potato casserole, homemade, from my grandmother's recipe, with the brown sugar crust and the little marshmallows on top. My mother-in-law looked at it the way you look at something you find on the bottom of your shoe. She thanked me, moved it to the far end of the counter near the trash, and served the caterer's version instead. My husband laughed it off. He was good at that. Laughing things off. For 7 years I watched him laugh things off. His mother's comments about my clothes, laughed off. Her habit of calling me his friend at family events even after 2 years of marriage, laughed off. The Christmas she gave every daughter-in-law a piece of the family jewelry and gave me a gift card to a home goods store. He laughed so hard he had tears in his eyes, and I sat in the car afterward and stared at the receipt in the envelope where a necklace should have been. I told myself it was survivable. I had my work. I had started a small logistics consulting firm out of the 2nd bedroom of our house 3 years into the marriage. Nothing glamorous. I helped mid-sized companies streamline their supply chain operations, reduced overhead, improved vendor relationships. It was quiet, unglamorous, spreadsheet and conference call work, and I was genuinely good at it. Within 2 years, I had 4 employees. Within 2 years, I had 22. My mother-in-law referred to it as her little hobby business at every family dinner until the year we crossed $2 million in revenue, at which point she stopped mentioning it entirely, which was somehow worse. My husband had opinions about the business too, mostly that I was working too much, that I was distracted, that I had checked out of the marriage. This was his way of describing any period in which I was not actively available to manage his emotional needs while also attending every family function his mother scheduled, which averaged roughly 3 per month and always seemed to fall on the same weekends I had client deadlines. The irony was that I loved him, or I had loved him. Somewhere underneath all of it, I think I had left the version of him I met at 24. Before I understood that version only existed when his mother wasn't in the room. The garbage bag moment happened on a Sunday in March. We had fought the night before, a real fight, the kind we'd been building toward for months. I had missed his cousin's engagement party because I was on a call with a client in Singapore who was considering a contract worth more than we'd made all of the previous year. My husband didn't care about the Singapore client. He cared that his mother had asked where I was, and he'd had to answer. By Sunday morning, his mother had driven 40 minutes from her house to ours. I came downstairs in my pajamas to find them sitting together at my kitchen table, the table I had picked out, in the house I paid more than half the mortgage on, with the energy of 2 people who had already made a decision. She slid the garbage bag across the table toward me. She said, and I remember this exactly, "I think it would be best for everyone if you took some time away. We've already spoken to an attorney." They had been to a lawyer, together, to begin divorce proceedings, without telling me. I looked at my husband. He looked at his coffee cup. I took the garbage bag. I packed 3 days of clothes, my laptop, my external hard drive, and my grandmother's casserole dish, the one my mother-in-law had exiled to the far counter at that first Thanksgiving. I drove to a Hampton Inn 20 minutes away and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Then I called my own attorney. Here's what they did not know about me. I had been quietly building something for 2 years that had nothing to do with the logistics firm. 18 months before the garbage bag Sunday, I had been approached by a private equity group that had been watching our growth. They weren't interested in buying the firm outright. They wanted to invest in a spin-off technology platform I had been developing on the side, a software tool that automated the kind of supply chain analysis I had been doing manually for clients for years. The negotiations had been slow and extremely confidential. I had told no one in my personal life, not my husband, not anyone. The reason I had been on that call with Singapore wasn't just about a consulting contract. It was the final step in a licensing agreement that would integrate our platform into their national freight infrastructure system. The deal closed on a Monday morning, 2 weeks after I checked into the Hampton Inn. The equity group's valuation triggered an automatic buyout clause I had negotiated into our original investment agreement. By Thursday of that week, my attorney called me with a number. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Panera Bread and read it twice. $58 million. I drove back to the Hampton Inn, sat on the bed again, and cried for about 45 minutes, not from happiness exactly, from the specific exhaustion of having carried something heavy for so long that when you finally put it down, you don't feel relief, you just feel the weight of all the years you spent carrying it. I didn't tell anyone. I checked into a longer-term extended stay, retained a second attorney who specialized in high-asset divorce, and spent the next 3 weeks being very quiet and very methodical. My husband's initial divorce filing had been sloppy. Their attorney, a family friend it turned out, not a specialist, had filed the basic paperwork without conducting any real discovery into marital assets. This was a significant oversight. The logistics firm had been built entirely during our marriage, funded in part with income from our joint account in the early years. My own attorney smiled when she reviewed the filings. She used the word favorable 4 times in our first meeting. I said nothing publicly. I deactivated my social media. I changed my phone number and gave the new one to exactly 6 people. The missed calls came to my old number. I know this because my assistant, who I had added to my contact list under a name my husband wouldn't recognize, forwarded me the log at my request. 91 calls in the first 48 hours after the deal became publicly registered, which happened because a Singapore trade publication ran a brief item about the licensing agreement that mentioned my name. 64 of those calls were from numbers I recognized: my mother-in-law, my husband, his sister, his brother, his aunt who had once told me at a Christmas party that I had an Akron energy and meant it as an insult, a cousin I had met twice, his college roommate who had never called me once in 7 years of marriage. My mother-in-law left 7 voicemails. I had my assistant transcribe them. The first 3 were warm, concerned. "We've been thinking about you, sweetheart. Please call us back." The 4th mentioned that she hoped this business situation hadn't been too overwhelming and that family was always there for support. The 5th dropped the warmth and got practical. She said there were some financial matters related to the property that needed to be discussed and that it was in everyone's interest to handle things privately and gracefully. The 6th was a longer version of the 5th. The 7th was her attorney asking me to call his office at my earliest convenience. I did not call. What I did instead was what I should have done years earlier. I went through 7 years of records. I documented every instance my husband had used our joint account for personal expenses he had categorized as business. I found a pattern that my attorney described as problematic and that a forensic accountant she hired described as consistent with financial misconduct. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and small and spread across years. The kind of thing that only appears when someone actually looks. But it was real, and it was documented, and once it was in front of a judge, it changed the nature of the proceedings considerably. I also discovered, during this process, that my mother-in-law had transferred a piece of property into my husband's name 3 months after our wedding, a commercial property that generated rental income, and that this transfer had been recorded in a way that attempted to classify it as a premarital asset despite the timing. My attorney's eyebrows went up when she saw it. She said the word intentional. The divorce was not clean. It took 11 months. There were motions and counter-motions and a mediation session that lasted 9 hours in a conference room with bad lighting and terrible coffee. My mother-in-law was not present, but her influence was in every document her son's attorney filed. I sat through all of it. I did not cry in any professional setting. I did not respond to any of the character statements his side submitted, the ones that described me as career-obsessed and emotionally unavailable, and, in one memorable filing, hostile to the concept of family. I let my attorney respond. I kept working. The settlement was finalized on a Thursday. I won't list the terms. What I will say is that my attorney called it exceptional, and then immediately asked if she could use the case anonymously in a presentation she was giving at a legal conference. I said yes. I signed the last document at 4 in the afternoon. I stopped at a grocery store on the way home and bought a rotisserie chicken and a bottle of good wine and a box of my grandmother's sweet potato casserole mix. The brand she used to buy, the one with the orange label. I ate dinner alone in the apartment I had rented at a table I had picked out, in a city where no one knew my name or my mother-in-law's name or what Akron energy meant. It was the best meal I had eaten in years. That was 6 months ago. I want to tell you what happened after because I think it matters. My mother-in-law reached out one more time, not by phone. She had apparently accepted I wasn't answering. She sent a letter to my corporate address, forwarded through her attorney, which told me she hoped I understood that her actions had come from a place of love for her son, and that she wished me well in my next chapter. It was 3 paragraphs long and managed, impressively, to contain no actual apology. What it contained was a suggestion, elegant and brief and clearly written by someone who had given it considerable thought, that given my recent success I might consider a gesture of goodwill regarding a piece of disputed property that had not gone her way in the settlement. I read it once, I set it on my desk. Then I fed it through the shredder I keep next to my filing cabinet and watched it come out in thin, pale strips. I do not believe in performing forgiveness for people who are not actually asking for it. That letter was not a request for forgiveness. It was a negotiation dressed in the language of closure. The logistics firm is still operating. We have 31 employees now. The technology platform completed its second major licensing agreement 4 months ago. I have a small office with a window that looks out over a park, and on most mornings I bring coffee and sit for 10 minutes before anyone else arrives, and just look at the trees. I think about those 7 years sometimes, not with bitterness exactly. Bitterness is too active, too present tense. More with a kind of clear-eyed recognition. My mother-in-law was not wrong that I didn't belong to her world. She was wrong about what that meant. She thought it was a deficiency. It turned out to be an instruction. When you spend years being told you are not enough, not the right name, not the right background, not sufficiently devoted to a family that never fully claimed you, one of 2 things happens. Either you spend your energy trying to close that gap, trying to be acceptable enough, present enough, grateful enough for the small allowances they make for your existence, or you redirect that energy somewhere else entirely. I had redirected it, for years, quietly, in the second bedroom, in conference calls from hotel rooms, in parking lots of Panera Breads where no one was watching. I had redirected every single watt of it. The garbage bag was not the cruelest thing my mother-in-law ever did to me. The cruelest thing was smaller. It was the accumulated weight of 7 years of being looked at like something that needed to be tolerated. The garbage bag was just the moment she made it legible. And honestly, in a way I am not sure I could have articulated at the time, I am grateful she did. Being pushed out of a place you were never truly welcomed is not a loss. It is a correction. I have built something real now. Not to prove anything to anyone, that framing still gives them too much space in the story. I built it because I am genuinely good at what I do, and because I had something to build, and because the years of not being chosen by them taught me, thoroughly and without meaning to, exactly how to choose myself. Blood does not make family. Presence does. Consistency does. The willingness to show up without an agenda and stay when it costs you something. That's what makes family. I have a handful of people in my life who meet that definition. They were not at those Christmas parties. They were in the Hampton Inn parking lot at 11 o'clock at night when I called them from my car and couldn't quite explain what had happened, and they stayed on the line anyway. That's the thing about being pushed out by people who only valued you conditionally. You find out very quickly who values you otherwise. If you've ever been made to feel like a guest in your own life, like you were there on approval, Like your belonging was always provisional. I want you to hear this. The approval was never the point. You were never waiting for their verdict. You were building the only thing that was ever actually yours. Keep building. The people who try to make you feel small will eventually need you to be large, and when that day comes, you will already know exactly what to do with a letter. I think about that pale blue cardigan a lot, not with anger anymore, just with a kind of quiet recognition. There is something almost instructive about the precision of that image. A woman wearing her Sunday best while doing something that small and that deliberate. It taught me, in a way nothing else had, that cruelty doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it comes in pearl buttons in a measured tone, and the people delivering it have fully convinced themselves they are being reasonable. What happened to my mother-in-law, to my husband, to all of it? None of it was luck. I want to be clear about that. The settlement didn't fall in my favor because the universe decided to balance some cosmic ledger. It went the way it did, because for years, while they were focused on keeping me small, I was focused on building something real. Every hour I spent in that second bedroom, every conference call I took from a hotel parking lot, every quiet decision I made not to tell them what I was actually doing, that was not avoidance. That was integrity. Doing the work honestly, carefully, without cutting corners, even when no one was watching and no one would have known the difference. That is the only foundation that holds. The intelligence part, and I say this not to flatter myself but because I think it matters, was in understanding what I was actually dealing with. I spent too many years trying to interpret my mother-in-law's behavior as something I could fix or earn my way out of. The smarter move, the one I eventually made, was to stop trying to change the system and start building outside of it entirely. The platform, the licensing deal, the confidential negotiations, none of that happened because I worked harder than everyone else. It happened because I eventually got very clear-eyed about where my energy was actually going and where it needed to go instead. Clarity is a form of intelligence that no one teaches you in school. You usually arrive at it through enough disappointment to stop lying to yourself. And then there is the part that is hardest to talk about, which is the years it took. 7 years is a long time to stay somewhere that is slowly making you smaller. I don't say that with judgment toward the person I was at 26, because she was doing what most people do. She was trying. She was absorbing the message that she wasn't quite enough and working harder to close the gap. What I know now is that the persistence I poured into that marriage, into those dinners, into trying to be acceptable, that same persistence, redirected, built something that changed my life. Grit is not the problem. Misdirected grit is the problem. The moment I stopped spending mine on their approval and started spending it on my own work, everything shifted. My mother-in-law's letter asked for a gesture of goodwill. What she didn't understand is that the most honest thing I could give her was exactly what she had given me. Nothing. Not out of cruelty. Out of accuracy. She had spent 7 years teaching me, very clearly, what she thought I was worth. I simply learned the lesson she intended and applied it in a direction she didn't anticipate. The shredder sits next to my filing cabinet. The strips of that letter are long gone. What remains is the window, the park, the coffee going warm in my hands on a quiet morning. That's the whole story, really. Not the money, not the settlement, just the morning, and the fact that it belongs entirely to me.